Hello, and thank you for joining us tonight on the Capitol Report on NTD Television. I'm your host, Melina Weisskopf, in for Steve Lance this week. Here's a look at some of the top stories of today. President Biden is in Poland. What's he doing just 60 miles from the border of Ukraine? And what new commitments has the U.S. made today? What's America's role in this? And how is the U.S. looking on the global stage? We'll hear from war veteran Congressman Greg Steube, who breaks it down for us. The war in Ukraine is impacting the supply of wheat abroad. President Biden is now working with European leaders to help with an expected global food shortage. We'll take a look at the president's plan of action. And why is this war overseas able to hit the global food supply? We'll get an explanation from a former agriculture commissioner, Congressman John Rose. Following a marathon of NATO and EU meetings in Brussels, President Biden today visits Poland. Plus a new deal by the U.S. to reduce Russian leverage on Europe. NTD's Iris Tao has more.
President Biden has arrived in Poland, which is bearing the brunt of an exodus of refugees from Ukraine.
Let's keep the democracies united.
And to show unity, the Friday trip follows a series of meetings among Western leaders and a Thursday announcement that the U.S. would accept 100,000 Ukrainians fleeing the country. And visiting the Polish town of Rzeszów today, Biden was just about 60 miles from the Ukraine border. But he said he wasn't allowed to go there due to security concerns.
Crisis, and quite frankly, part of my disappointment is that I can't see it firsthand.
Biden was speaking alongside the Polish president as he was briefed on the refugee situation. He also compared Ukrainians to those who stood up to the Chinese communist regime.
When you see a 30-year-old woman standing there in front of a tank with a rifle, I mean, talk about what happened in Tiananmen Square. That's Tiananmen Square squared.
The president also met with U.S. troops stationed in Poland, telling them that they're in a fight between democracies and autocracies.
What you're engaged in is much more than just whether or not you can alleviate the pain and suffering of the people of Ukraine. We're in a new phase. Your generation, we're at an inflection point.
And earlier on Friday,
we're coming together to reduce Europe's dependence on Russian energy.
The U.S. and the EU announced a new deal to reduce the continent's reliance on Russian energy. The U.S. will work to supply 15 billion cubic meters of liquefied natural gas, or LNG, to the European Union this year. And on Saturday, Biden will hold a bilateral meeting with the Poland president to talk about the current refugee crisis. And before heading back to Washington, Biden will also deliver a, quote, major address to wrap up his trip to Europe. Reporting in Washington, D.C., Iris Tao, NTD News.
So this 4-day trip is a big deal for President Biden to set an image for America on the global stage. To take a closer look at this, your regular host, Steve Lance, spoke with war veteran and Congressman Greg Steube.
Congressman Greg Steube, thank you for joining us on the Capitol Report.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Congressman, you're a war veteran. I think you could speak to this next question I have for you with a lot more credibility than most. When it comes to, and thank you for your service. Yeah, when it comes to the war in Ukraine, Russia's invasion, where do you think the U.S.'s national interest lies?
Well, there are so many things that led up to this that we did not do because the Biden administration refused to see the warning signs, refused to act, refused to come from a position of strength. And a lot of those as it relates to economic sanctions, sanctions on Russian oil, sanctions on Russian gas. And even when the Russians were building up on the Ukrainian border, it was at that point in time when there was 120,000 troops. I mean, it didn't take a genius to figure out that Putin was going to do something. Otherwise, you wouldn't have amassed 120,000 troops right on the border of the Ukraine. At that point in time, sanctions should have been put in place against the Russian government, against Russian oligarchs, against Putin, against Russian oil, Russian gas, instead of destroying our own domestic production of oil and then importing Russian oil to make up for that. We should have sanctioned all of that. And I don't know if it would necessarily have changed the path that Putin had in his mind, but it would have already put in huge economic impacts to the decisions that they were going to make. And Zelensky said himself, there was a group of, I sit on foreign affairs, There was a group of members that had an opportunity to go there and meet with him and speak with him. And he said that the Nord Stream 2 pipeline sanctions that Biden lifted, that Trump administration had put in place, opened up billions of dollars of revenue to the Russians that allowed for the money to fund the invasion. And so had we not done that as a government, the Biden administration not done that, I think we wouldn't be where we are today. And so they were emboldened to do what they did. The Western world didn't sanction them. And now with all of that background, you're now looking at what's occurring in the Ukraine. And while this is happening, you have this administration negotiating through the Russians and the Chinese to the Iranians on an Iran nuclear deal. So what Russia now realizes is they can avoid all of these Western sanctions by going through the Iranians in an Iranian deal. It makes absolutely no sense for the safety and security of the American people. It makes no sense internationally, and you're obfuscating the sanctions that the Western world has in place on Russia right now if you do that deal, which all talk is that the Biden administration is going to go forward with that deal.
There's a lot packed in there. I have a few follow-ups for you. I guess the first one, just real fast, is in terms of the NATO allies and the countries in Europe, do you think the United States is doing enough?
Well, obviously those NATO allies that are in Europe should be doing more. It's a neighbor to them. They would only benefit not only militarily but economically to the actions that they would take there because it's their neighbor and in their region. I do support us. We voted on a $14 billion package to the Ukraine. It passed with overwhelming bipartisan support. I think there was only like 4 or 5 no votes out of 435. So there's a lot of support in Congress to help the Ukrainian people, both militarily and economically at this time. NATO, I think, needs to continue to do more. The other allies in Europe, I think, should do more. I supported transferring the MiGs from Poland to the Ukraine so that Ukrainian pilots could fight. And what I think we should have done a long time ago is arm the Ukrainians, knowing that at some point Vladimir was going to do this.
Now, it sounds like what you're saying, or what you said, in your first answer as well, is that to prevent this, it required a little bit of foresight and some tough decisions to be made that may not have been, of popular opinion at that time. Applying that same logic to the situation with China and Taiwan, do you think that, this should open our eyes to how we should be handling this situation?
100%. And to think that our enemies in China was not watching what happened in Afghanistan and how this administration dealt with that, is not watching what's happening in the Ukraine and how the NATO countries, the United States is reacting to that, would be very short-sighted. They're absolutely watching every move that the NATO allies make, that the NATO countries make. They're watching very closely what the United States is willing to do because they know if they were to go into Taiwan, there would be a similar response. Now, our agreements with Taiwan are very different than they are with the Ukraine. We have defense agreements with Taiwan. But as we sit here and have a conversation, last year there was 180 military sorties of Chinese aircraft into Taiwanese airspace. Since this year, it's over 40. Incursions of Chinese military aircraft into Taiwanese airspace. So they're already prodding to see what they're willing to get away with, what the Taiwanese and the Americans are willing to let them do.
Congressman Greg Steube, thank you.
Thanks for having me.
President Biden is warning that parts of the globe can expect to see food shortages. The sanctions on Russia and the war in Ukraine will have an impact on countries relying heavily on wheat supplied from the region. The U.S. and Canada are also major suppliers of wheat. The administration says that the shortages will not impact the U.S., but will be felt particularly in the Middle East and Africa. These two regions heavily rely on wheat from Russia and Ukraine. Biden announced today that the U.S. will be working with the European Union to increase global food security and directly provide food supply. And he says that European countries are being urged to end trade restrictions for sending food abroad. So why does this war overseas impact the global food supply? Congressman John Rose, a former commissioner of agriculture for the state of Tennessee, explains that it's not our ability to produce food in the U.S. that's limited. It's our extended supply chain that's the sticking point. Here's that interview with Steve Lance.
Congressman John Rose, thank you so much for joining us on the Capitol Report again.
Good morning. Good to be here.
Russia's invasion of Ukraine has brought about many issues. We're seeing higher gas prices, which we were seeing prior to. But one major issue is the the food supply. There's talk that that area of the world produces 30% of the world's grain. President Biden just recently warned of a potential food crisis. What should we make of this?
Well, I think it is a concern. Fortunately for us here in the United States, we have throughout the country's history been able to produce more than enough food to feed our own people and then to supply much of the world. And so we have a lot of excess capacity here in this country. I think we can pick up some of the slack. I think one of the concerns is that we have become, unfortunately, increasingly dependent on extended supply chains for various inputs that make agriculture work, things like fertilizer, agrochemicals, other inputs that are important to the modern agricultural production complex. And so we do have to worry about that, and we need to, I think it underscores once again why we should be worried about where our supply chains reach and who we're relying on for key ingredients or key inputs that are essential to producing a reliable supply of even food for the American people and for the rest of the world.
Congressman, I want to ask you, when it comes to domestic energy production, the United States is the cleanest producer of energy in the entire world, yet the Democrats are dead set against us producing energy. It just seems like, I'm trying to make sense of it. I want to get your perspective as to why.
Well, I guess it's anybody's guess as to why, but I think they're so committed to the notion that we need to reduce our use of hydrocarbons. It doesn't make sense. Obviously, it's going to take time to transition to clean energy sources. And in the meantime, what makes the most sense is to use the resources, number one, that are easiest and cleanest to produce, and number two, that advance other goals like making this country energy independent and making us less dependent on despots around the world who are, to say the least, not concerned about climate change or the Green New Deal or reducing hydrocarbons. They're worried about or devoted and committed to pursuing their despotic notions of world conquest.
Yeah, a lot of the Republicans that I speak with, some of your colleagues, nobody's against clean energy solutions. So I don't understand, is there a conflict between the two?
Well, there shouldn't be. I think it's, I've got a 4-year-old and a 1-year-old, and when they want ice cream, they want it right now. And I think that's what we see coming from the Democrats and the Democratic Party, is that they want to have clean energy instantly the moment they think of it. And they don't have the maturity apparently to realize that it takes time to accomplish these big lofty goals.
Congressman John Rose, thank you.
Thank you.
Former President Trump's lawsuit against Hillary Clinton seeks damages amounting to at least $24 million and a jury trial. The complaint alleges crimes including conspiracy, theft of trade secrets, and obstruction of justice. It targets ex-British spy Christopher Steele along with around 30 others.
He should sue everyone involved. There was a quite insidious effort to fabricate false evidence against then candidate Trump, and that effort continued even after the election, and there was a great deal of conspiratorial design that some very powerful people in government and in politics that were involved in that. So when the Republicans take the majority through our committee oversight authority, we should investigate aggressively, and there should be criminal referrals that come from those investigations. I intend to be a part of that.
Allegations that Trump was colluding with Russia, normally referred to as the Russian collusion, dragged on for years, going back to before Trump was elected in 2016. Basically, Trump is suing over reports that he claims were meant to weave a false narrative to ruin his bid for presidency. Those compiled reports are usually referred to as the Steele dossier. They were based on sources that Steele claimed were from inside Russia. Many claims contained in that dossier were later confirmed as false, while others have never been proven. This case was filed in a Florida federal court and is assigned to a Clinton nominee judge. But a different judge could handle some or all of those proceedings. North Korea's missile launch grabbed the attention of the White House this week, and now the former administration has their own thoughts on it. Former Vice President Mike Pence said today that this stopped happening under the Trump administration because they say, quote, Trump stood up to Kim Jong-un. This came after North Korea launched yesterday what is thought to be its first intercontinental ballistic missile. North Korea's state news outlet shared on Twitter what seems like a music video of Kim Jong-un preparing for the launch. The missile flew almost 700 miles for about an hour and landed in Japanese waters. More Republican senators are confirming they plan to vote no to Judge Jackson's confirmation. We'll take a look at why they're opposing her and how likely it is that she'll be confirmed with only Democrat votes. Republicans are eager to take back the House this fall, and if they secure the seats they have and flip just 5 more, they'll have it. What's their messaging now, and what are their plans if they do win the majority? A Republican congressman from Nebraska is found guilty of 3 felony counts, but it's not clear if the GOP congressman, who served 9 terms, will suspend his campaign for re-election. Hello and welcome back to NTD's Capitol Report. Supreme Court nominee Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson is facing mounting opposition from Senate Republicans. Senator Ted Cruz is one of the latest Republicans to confirm that he'll vote no. Cruz went to law school with Jackson and says he likes her as a person, but he has concerns about her record.
And whether it comes to free speech or religious liberty or the Second Amendment, many of those rights are hanging by a thread, hanging by a single vote. And based on Judge Jackson's record, I believe if she's confirmed, that she will consistently vote to undermine those rights.
And Senate Republican leader Mitch McConnell also confirmed this week that he'll vote no. That's because he's concerned that she would be what he calls a judicial activist, meaning he suspects she'll try to change policies instead of sticking strictly to constitutional interpretations.
President Biden said he would only nominate a judicial activist. Unfortunately, we saw no reason to suspect that he accidentally did the opposite.
McConnell is also disappointed that Jackson did not completely reject a proposal to add more justices to the 9-member court.
The most radical pro-court packing fringe groups badly wanted this nominee for this vacancy. Judge Jackson was the court packer's pick, and she testified like it.
McConnell and some other senators also say that Jackson is soft on crime. But despite Republican opposition, it's looking very likely that Judge Jackson will be confirmed to the nation's highest court. Democrats only need 50 votes to get her seated, and so far that's looking promising. Today, Democratic Senator Joe Manchin confirmed he will vote yes to Jackson. And he's a crucial swing vote in the Senate. So if all 50 Democrats are on board, Vice President Kamala Harris would break that tie, casting the final vote to confirm Biden's Supreme Court nominee. And Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas was released today from Sibley Hospital in Washington, D.C. The 73-year-old has been in the hospital for about 1 week where he was treated for an infection. And House Republicans this week are gathered in Florida to discuss their top priorities, considering they need to flip only 5 seats to take back the House. What's their messaging as they gear up for midterms? Here's House Republican Conference Chairwoman Elise Stefanik.
Well, I think President Joe Biden and House Democrats are definitely attempting to pass the buck and trying to blame Russia for, frankly, problems and crises that Democrat policies in the United States have caused. And the American people are smart. They've seen the rise in energy prices prior to the war on Ukraine. They've seen the historic rise of inflation prior to the war on Ukraine. They saw the supply chain crisis prior to the war on Ukraine. So the reality is, and polling shows this, that the American people directly believe that the crises they're facing today are a result of far-left unified government in Washington. So I think you're going to continue, unfortunately, to hear from the White House podium trying to blame others. But when you're president of the United States, the buck stops with you, and we're just not seeing any strong leadership from this administration. We're just seeing weakness.
So what would the party focus on if they are able to flip the House? House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy is planning 7 task forces focused on jobs and the economy, big tech censorship, American freedoms, energy, climate, and competition with China. McCarthy is likely to take the House Speaker position if the GOP can manage to win those seats. But it will take some work to get any of these Republican priorities signed by President Biden. Stefanik says they can only hope Biden will be willing to sign off on some of their Republican-led legislation. A Republican congressman from Nebraska is found guilty of 3 felony counts. Representative Jeff Fortenberry was charged last October for concealing information and making false statements to federal authorities. Both House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy and Speaker Nancy Pelosi said today that Representative Fortenberry should resign from Congress. The charges are related to an investigation into illegal campaign contributions in 2016. Fortenberry has served in Congress since 2005. He was charged with 1 count of scheming to falsify and conceal material facts and 2 counts of making false statements to federal investigators. Each charge carries a maximum penalty of 5 years in federal prison, as well as fines. Fortenberry is planning to immediately repeal the decision. He says he believes the trial was unfair. It's not clear if the GOP candidate will suspend his campaign for re-election. Democratic Congressman Philemon Vela of Texas is resigning in a few weeks. Vela is the most recent to leave Washington in a long line of over 30 retiring Democrats. Vela once threatened to derail President Biden's Build Back Better spending bill. Republican candidate Mayra Flores accused Vela of, quote, bailing on his constituents. She tweeted a picture showing a letter on the congressman's door. It reads, "Welcome to the office of Congressman Philemon Vela. At the moment, we are not accepting visitors." After he resigns, the Texas governor will call a special election to fill his seat. And that's all we have for you tonight on the Capitol Report. Thank you for tuning in. From Washington, D.C., I'm Melina Weiskup, and we'll see you next week.